Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of SBI's Revenue Growth Help Desk. I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Scott Gruher, Senior Partner at SBI. And Scott and I are going to cover the insights from our recent Chief Commercial Officer Growth Forum. So Scott, always good to see you, brother. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. You still take my invitations, which is always good. I know when you ignore me that I've got trouble. So Gru, we had a pretty esteemed group together a few weeks ago. We've been doing these for years. We used to do them all in person. Now we do them virtually. But I tell you one thing is you and I always walk away so fascinated by what's on the mind of some of the best and brightest that lead the commercial function. So Gru, maybe let's level set. Have you explained to the audience the difference between the CRO and a Chief Commercial Officer, the way we think about it, and then we'll hit the highlights of the three big topics that we covered.
Yeah. So in recent years, we've seen more of the President and Chief Commercial Officer role popping up, especially in technology companies. And the difference is the CRO in the past was mainly focused on revenue from a sales perspective, right? But now, as you look at technology companies, the importance of marketing and customer success specifically have continued to rise. Yeah. So it's made a lot of sense to really bridge that gap between marketing, sales, customer success, and own the whole customer life cycle. And that's what the Chief Customer Officer role is, or Chief Client Officer, whatever you call it.
Yep. Yeah. And the President title continues to move to these people. And some of the folks that you and I've gotten to know over the years, and as we've seen the role evolve, both in public companies and private equity owned companies. And our group was a mix. So Gru, we had the definition, we've seen this evolution in the role, and there was three topics that stood out. And it's ironic we're talking about the role because one of them was, how do you move from the Chief Commercial Officer to the CEO? And this is something that you and I have seen. And I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. The second one we talked about is just the evolution of commercial effectiveness and what that really means and how people are thinking about things. And then number three is the workplace of the future. Is it everybody back in the office? Is it everybody still back at home? Do I run a hybrid model? How do I know what's what? And how do I think through that? So I guess for the first section, Gru, and we had a guest join us from Spencer Stewart, who obviously spends a lot of time recruiting and sourcing, and specifically in and around their tech CEO practice to share some perspective. But I guess, Gru, if you were sort of netting out for the group how to think about that evolution, and when you want to move from being the Chief Commercial Officer to being the CEO, what were a couple of the big things you would want the audience to walk away with?
Yeah, I guess one thing we talked about as a group, which I thought was fascinating, is just the premium on growth these days as compared to 10 or 15 years ago, especially in private equity-owned companies, right? It used to be you buy a company, you maybe change out some of the talent, you find some synergies, cut some costs, turn the thing around and make a bigger multiple. But now the premium's on growth, and with multiples being so high in private equity right now, you got to grow it. So CEOs that have that background are now a premium in private equity. And one of the things that Mike told us that I thought was an interesting statistic was 2/3 of the CEOs were promoted from within a company. So the chances are you're going to get promoted if you're a CCO into CEO within your current company. So if you're looking outside the walls, not a great chance right now. Yeah. That was one thing. The other thing is the type of Chief Commercial Officers that are out there and which ones make the best CEOs. And we categorize them as the builder, somebody likes to take something that doesn't really exist and create it. The transformer, they take something that's kind of a mess and make it into something that's not a mess. And then the operator, which takes the strategy from the CEO or from someone else and just runs it. And of course, there's a combination, but what we find is a lot of those CEOs are really more the kind of that builder profile or the transformer, not as much the operator. That's more of the old CRO role, typically, where somebody kind of runs the trains and they're really good at running forecast calls, things like that. Maybe not as strategic.
And so, Gru, on those components around those three archetypes, and you and I have seen that in our almost, I guess it's a decade and a half now of SBI. If I'm in one of those three archetypes, can I move to the next archetype, or am I branded for life? Like, how do I evolve as the CCO to let the organization know and let the board know, like, hey, I've got the headroom to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can evolve. Number one, to answer your question directly, I think a lot of chief sales officers / chief revenue officers in the past were seen as all they cared about is another dollar of revenue, and they didn't really care about their peers. They didn't really understand the overall company strategy. They didn't necessarily understand all the financials of the business. And that's changing, especially with the chief commercial officer role. You have to be more well-rounded. You have to be able to influence your peers. You got to look at the entire revenue life cycle. You got to understand the financials, spend time with your CFO. And in doing so, we're seeing some folks move really upstream, if you will, from kind of just a pure operator to more of that builder. And they're more well-rounded, more valuable as a CEO.
Yep. Yep. Gru, is there anything that you noticed, you know, as because it was that first section of the meeting that we always classically run out of time, and Melissa was rushing us through because we were going over, but it was so robust. I guess, was there a takeaway or a pattern that you noticed with the attendees that, as you think about our viewers right now, if there's one thing for them to work on, what can they work on right now in the back half of 21?
Yeah, I think the entire group admitted they could be, number one, better cross-functionally.
Yeah.
So really understanding what's coming out of product and how that flows through the entire, what I call commercial supply chain, pricing and packaging, marketing, sales, customer success, and those interlocks between each one of those. That's a big one. Number two is really making better friends with the CFO. Sometimes the chief revenue officer and the CFO butt heads, but the CFO can be your best friend if you really take some interest in what the CFO does and what they deal with versus just trying to avoid them, which some people do.
And when you become a CEO, you recognize very quickly that the CFO is your best friend. you can't be successful without one. So, okay, very good. All right, Gru. So that was topic one. Topic two, and we spent this time on the evolution of the commercial model, right? And there were a couple of sub themes in there. So that's a big consulting-ish term that I just used. So I get to sound intelligent. You're actually going to bring substance to my pretend intelligence. What were the sub themes that we spent time on?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we started talking about evolution of the commercial model and how you need a really good revenue growth strategy, right? How you're going to clearly articulate, clearly going to allocate resources against the corporate strategy and really bring each one of those commercial levers to life. And the group stopped this pretty quickly and said, you know, first you have to have a clear corporate strategy, which is fair. We go into companies all the time that have what they call a corporate strategy, and it's not that there isn't one at all. It's not at a granular level where it's actionable. It'll be metrics on a slide and a couple of pillars, but it doesn't really feed into the revenue growth strategy and then cascade into the revenue growth execution plan. And when that happens, you have clarity at the top. The CEO thinks, hey, we have a very clear corporate strategy. But as you go down in the organization, execution doesn't align to it.
Yeah. And then Scott, if you build on that, and for those that are listening and watching, if you think about this documentation of the corporate strategy, simply put, where do we play? How do we win? And if we think future back 3 to 5 years now, what are our aspirations that are quantified? And what are the 3 to 5 strategic initiatives that we're going to bet on with owners that will deliver that piece? It's not a 10-year plan, it's not a 20-year plan, but it's not an annual plan. So we talked about dimensioning that. But I guess, Gru, one of the things around the commercial model where a lot of people were asking questions was the allocation of resources and dollars, specifically when it comes to, hey, got a lot of companies coming out with new products, a lot of companies trying to make the move to digital, a lot of companies that have been forced to reimagine how they serve their customers. So share a little bit about that with the team.
Yeah. We're seeing more and more companies allocate dollars towards kind of more of a product-led growth strategy. in making their product easy to consume, easy to find, and taking friction out of the system.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one. Another is we're seeing $1 of commercial spend. If it used to be 80 cents sales, 10 cents marketing, 10 cents customer success, just for illustrative purposes, it's now 30 cents marketing, 50 cents sales, and 20 cents customer success. So it's spreading out, and those are becoming more important levers to drive revenue growth. So those were a couple of the key things we talked about. And then just recalibrate on the customer experience.
Yes.
This comes up a lot. People say it, we need to recalibrate our customer experience, we need to map the buyer's journey, but actually doing this where you get to the level where you clearly understand where you differentiate by customer touch point is a lot harder than it sounds. And as we talked to the group, they agreed.
Yeah, before we finish this segment, Gruher, one of my takeaways in that section was people talk about digitizing the sales force or digitizing the commercial engine. Said more simply, that's like, what technology do I have in my go-to-market tech stack that's allowing my salespeople to have more selling time and drive higher productivity per head at a lower cost basis? So for those that are watching and listening, as you think about the back half of 21, when you're thinking about your digital and the digital capability of your sales force, as you commercialize that spend, to Scott's point, you got to think about what technology are you putting in the hands to have a frictionless seller experience along with the frictionless customer experience. And that continues to be a hot topic. So then, Gruher, let me hit you with the last section, which was workplace of the future. Like, what does go-to-market effectiveness look like? Who's virtual? Who's in person? So talk a little bit about what we observed and what we heard from our team.
Yeah, I mean, if I net it out, the kind of headline is the leverage is shifted from the employer to the employee. And the seller right now is very demanding.
Yeah.
As are many employees. They want to live wherever they want. They want to get paid more. They don't want to go into an office. And they want to be treated fairly, which they should be anyway. But there's more of this leverage going towards the employee. And a lot of people are trying to figure out, how do we win talent in the marketplace? It's super competitive out there, and do it without breaking the bank. And then how do we think about reconstituting a team versus being a bunch of individuals that are virtually dispersed? And the answer came down to, it depends, of course, but a lot of people are going back to a hybrid model pretty soon, actually, where some people come into the office episodically, but they're not necessarily in an office all the time. It's somewhat voluntary, and they're trying to figure out when that pivots to more of a full-time office job or coming back into the office more regularly.
Yeah. Scott, one of my takeaways listening to the group was, there were a couple of folks who were very outspoken about, like, why does having the salespeople in the office improve the experience of our customer? And I thought that was really thoughtful, the way they position that, like, said a little more crudely, like, if the customer doesn't care, who cares? And no one really had a great answer. And this is something, obviously, that our internal team here at SBI is working on a broad body of research that we're with in August around what does it look like by end market, who's doing what and why. But Scott, I think you're right. Like, the leverage has moved and the control has moved to the seller because they have options, right? It's a totally different experience. So it was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, agreed. The one other thing I heard there is people are trying to figure out how do we stem A-player turnover? In the past, a lot of our turnover was people that weren't necessarily the top of the stack, and now they're better people are leaving. And why? Is it just because of the pandemic? Is it because there's a lot of jobs out there that are paying more? Is it because you can live wherever you want? And a lot of people don't know, but we're seeing it pretty broadly. Yeah. So something to keep an eye on.
Yep. And I thought there was a really good idea from one of the members around this whole concept of, like, pulse surveys of the sales force, right? Like, whether it's every other week or once a month, to just ask 2 or 3 questions, right? Are you getting to play to your strengths? Do you feel like you're supported? And sometimes, oftentimes companies will do engagement surveys once a year. once every 6 months. You know, we always do our sort of traditional revenue growth index surveys of the sales force across the ecosystem. But I think the kind of feed forward as opposed to feedback is a good approach that we're seeing for modern organizations. So for those that are out there, you got to give people a voice, because if you don't, they're going to shout either way. And if it's not coming to you, it's going somewhere else. So, all right, Gru, good to see you, man. Thanks for spending a little time. And for those watching and listening, we always appreciate your attention and your support. Continued success as you try and make your number.